The mud on his boots was real. That was the thing nobody thought to check. The man who arrived in Sycamore Hollow, Mississippi on a Tuesday in early April had mud on his boots that went all the way to the ankle, the kind that only happened if you'd been walking a field before dawn, not the kind you applied for the occasion. He drove a truck with a cracked windshield and a bumper held together by something optimistic. He carried one bag. He rented the small room above Mrs. Patton's garage for $220 a month, cash, and he was polite about it in a way that was somehow different from performance, quieter, more settled, like a man who had decided to be somewhere and was simply being there. The town of Sycamore Hollow didn't know who he was. Not his real name. Not the money. Not the life he'd folded up like a letter and put away in a drawer somewhere back in Memphis. And the woman he was about to meet, she didn't know either. What she did know was that she was done pretending she wasn't lonely. What she was about to learn was the difference between testing for safety and being willing to be found. Stay with me. Because the mud was real. But the name wasn't. And what grew between them anyway, that was the realest thing of all. Nadia Beaumont was 33 years old and had the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to manage her own wants before anyone else noticed she had them. She had grown up in Sycamore Hollow, which distinguished her from most of her college friends who'd scattered to Atlanta and Memphis and Nashville and come back only for funerals and Christmas. Nadia had gone to Ole Miss, returned, and stayed, not from failure but from choice, a choice she reasserted quietly every year when she filed her taxes as the owner and operator of Beaumont Herb Collective, a working farm and dried goods business her grandmother had started in 1971 and that Nadia had quietly doubled in revenue by the time she was 28. She drove a good truck, bought locally when she could, and had a house on 4 acres with a kitchen garden that took up more of her emotional energy than she would readily admit. She wore her money the way women in that part of Mississippi learned to wear good things, without emphasis, without apology, without announcement. Her boots were quality but broken in. Her truck was 3 years old but well maintained. The produce she sold at the farmer's market was priced fairly because she knew what fair meant, and she'd grown up watching her grandmother refuse to exploit anyone's hunger. The two men who had marked her were not villains. That was the complicated part. The first was Calvin, from graduate school, a good-looking man from Jackson who was in love with her in the way that was entirely about how she made him look and almost nothing about who she was. She'd figured this out after 18 months, too slowly, when she realized they'd had the same argument 12 different times and it was always, at its core, about whether her work was as serious as his. She ended it with one conversation and did not cry about it, which told her something. The second was Damon. Damon was the one that required time to process. He was from Sycamore Hollow, which felt safe, and he was charming in a way that was personal rather than general. He remembered things, small things, the way people do when they're paying attention or practicing to seem like they are. A year in, she discovered he had borrowed $11,000 from her grandmother's account, which he had access to because Nadia had trusted him with the business accounts when her grandmother was ill. He hadn't taken it all at once. He'd taken it in amounts small enough to stay unnoticed. She did not press charges. Her grandmother asked her not to. She spent 3 months reorganizing the farm's finances, and she did not let herself feel used, because feeling used meant she'd trusted wrong, and she could not afford to think of herself that way. So she thought of it differently. She thought of it as, I know more now. What she knew now was that she could not read people clearly when she wanted something from them. When she wanted something, she found evidence for it. So she simply stopped wanting, or told herself she had. She threw herself into the farm. She was pleasant and present and closed at the center. Her friend Rochelle said she was impossible to know anymore. Nadia said she was just busy. She was not just busy. The man who called himself James Cooper arrived in Sycamore Hollow with exactly enough of a story to seem plausible. He was from Memphis, he said. Had farmed in his family before, knew his way around soil. Was looking to get away from things for a while. Needed work and a room and some time to be somewhere quiet. His real name was not James Cooper. His real name was Elijah Beaumont Ross, which was not a name anyone in Sycamore Hollow would recognize, though several people in Memphis, Nashville, and Chicago would have. His grandfather had built Ross Agricultural Supply from 2 truck beds and a plot of Delta farmland into the largest black-owned agricultural distribution company in the Mid-South. His father had grown it into something that required lawyers and boards and quarterly reports. Elijah had grown up in a house with a gatehouse. He was also, at 36, completely exhausted by being known before he arrived. He'd had 3 serious relationships, all of them with women who'd introduced themselves to the version of him that came with context. With the company name, the address, the family reputation. He'd wondered for years what it would be like to be chosen plainly. To have someone see him on a Tuesday with mud on his boots and decide he was worth something. His cousin Deshaun thought he'd lost his mind. His mother had said nothing, which was worse. He'd chosen Sycamore Hollow because it was far enough from Memphis, small enough that his name wouldn't travel, and had a listing on a local farming board for day labor that he'd answered under a borrowed name. He was serious about the work. That part wasn't performance. He could work land, had spent every summer until 18 doing exactly that, at his grandfather's insistence, because the old man believed you had to know what your business was built on from the ground up. So the mud was real. The willingness to work was real. The desire to be somewhere nobody was watching what he represented, that was the realest thing he'd brought with him. He navigated the town with the particular awareness of a man who had spent his life in spaces where his money was visible and spent the last 3 weeks in a space where it wasn't. The hardware store. The diner. The church parking lot where men gathered after service to talk about nothing in particular. He said little, listened more, didn't volunteer opinions about things he hadn't yet earned the right to have opinions about. When the older men talked about soil conditions or the drought 2 summers back, he asked questions. When they gave answers, he remembered them. He was not performing humility. He was practicing presence. And the first time he saw Nadia Beaumont across the Sycamore Hollow Farmers Market, standing behind a table of dried lavender and rosemary bundles with a ledger book open in her left hand, he understood that he had found the specific complicated thing he hadn't known he was looking for. She needed a hand at the farm for the April planting. She put the listing up at the feed store on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning she had 3 inquiries. James Cooper's was written by hand on a piece of notepaper that said simply, available, know the work, can start Friday, and had a phone number. She hired him on the basis of a 5-minute phone call in which he answered her questions directly and without padding. She would pay him by the day. He would start with the South Beds. He showed up Friday before she expected him. This was the first thing she noticed. Not early in an obsequious way, not standing at the door at 7 when she'd said 8, but working the soil along the fence line when she came out at 8:15 with her coffee, having clearly found where to start without needing to be told. The South Beds are across the yard, she called. I know, he said. This section needed turning first or you'd lose moisture when you open the south. Figured I'd start here. She stood for a moment with her coffee. He wasn't looking at her. He was working. She walked over and looked at what he'd done. He was right. She knew he was right because she'd thought the same thing and talked herself out of prioritizing it given the schedule. She did not say he was right. She said, all right then. She went back inside. When she came out an hour later, he had finished the fence section and moved precisely to the South Beds. Over the next several days their conversations were almost entirely practical. Drainage. Seed depth. When to expect rain. He didn't try to make anything social out of it. But one afternoon she came back from a delivery to find he'd repotted 4 of her lavender starters that had been struggling in 2 small containers. He'd asked Mrs. Patton for the right size pots and done it on his lunch break. He'd left them by the greenhouse door and said nothing about it. She stood there for a moment looking at them. Did you do these? She said, when he came back from checking the irrigation line. They were drowning, he said simply. She looked at the pots. She looked at him. Something about his face, the absence of the waiting to be thanked that most people had after doing something thoughtful, caught her off guard. She said, thank you. He nodded. Went back to work. The weeks that followed moved in the rhythm of shared physical labor, which has its own particular intimacy, the kind built from proximity and weather and the language of a specific place, the south beds and the greenhouse in the back 40 where the wild rosemary grew along the creek bank. He worked hard and without complaint. He brought his lunch and ate outside unless invited, which she did, twice, and then as a matter of practice, because she found she wanted the company in a way she didn't feel the need to interrogate. He was not performing ease. He was simply easy. He talked about what he knew: soil chemistry, irrigation timing, the particular stubbornness of clay, and when she talked, he listened the way people listened when they were genuinely curious rather than waiting for their turn. She started telling him small things. That her grandmother had planted the first lavender row in 1977 and refused to explain why lavender in Mississippi. That she sometimes drove the back roads at night when she couldn't sleep and the farm felt too quiet. That she'd almost sold the farm twice and both times something stopped her that she couldn't name. He received these things without making a large moment of them. He brought her coffee one morning without being asked, having simply observed how she took it black, early, from the blue thermos. He remembered that she was allergic to something in the commercial weed treatments and double-checked before he used anything near the beds she tended herself. He fixed a gate hinge that had been loose since before he arrived, and when she asked why he'd bothered, he said the sound of it bothered him. She laughed at that. He smiled. She was lowering something. She could feel it. She told herself it was fine. He was an employee and a decent person and it was fine. Okay, I want to pause and ask you something real. Have you ever been in a situation where someone was showing you exactly who they were: patient, kind, consistent, and your past made it almost impossible to just receive that? Where you were almost looking for a reason not to trust it? Tell me in the comments. Because that's where Nadia is right now, and it matters more than she knows. It was a small thing that triggered it. Always a small thing. He'd taken a phone call. She hadn't meant to overhear. She was coming around the barn side and he was behind it, back to the wall, and she heard him say something about, and she caught only pieces, because she stopped walking as soon as she understood she'd walked into something, a property, and numbers that sounded large, and a name she didn't catch, but that was clearly the name of someone who expected things of him. She went back the way she came. In the house, she made herself tea she didn't drink and thought about what she'd heard. It could be anything. Family matter. Old debt. Land he'd left behind. She did not know enough to make it into anything. But the thing was, she didn't know enough. 3 weeks, and she realized she still knew almost nothing concrete about James Cooper. Memphis. Farming background. No last name visible on anything except that first slip of notepaper. She hadn't looked him up because she hadn't thought to, and now she thought, why hadn't she thought to? Because she'd wanted to not think to. That was the honest answer. She began to watch differently. The way his hands were slightly too smooth for someone who'd been farming since boyhood. The way he used certain words, sometimes infrastructure, equity, words that lived in a different vocabulary than the one the rest of his sentences occupied. The way he'd answered her question about where he'd gotten his soil knowledge with a pause just half a beat too long before saying, family farm. She did not want to be Nadia before Damon again. That woman who saw what she wanted to see. She watched. And what she found made her more afraid, not less, because what she found was nothing wrong at all. Which meant the wrongness was hiding somewhere she hadn't thought to look yet. Her cousin Marcus owed her a long-standing favor. Marcus was 26, pleasant-looking, and thoroughly capable of seeming casually interested in something he'd been specifically asked to investigate. Nadia called him on a Thursday night and described what she needed. Just information. Just clarity. Marcus said he understood and didn't ask too many questions. The following Saturday was the Sycamore Hollow Spring Festival, a small annual event on the town green, booths and music and a competition for the best preserved goods that Nadia had won 3 years running. She had a booth. James had offered to help run it. While he was at the booth, Marcus was doing 2 things. First, walking slowly past and engaging James in conversation, light, social, probing in the way a 26-year-old can probe without seeming to. Asking where he was from, what he'd done before. Just talking. Listening for the seams. Second, looking up James Cooper, Memphis, farming background, on his phone, with every variation of the search he could construct. Nadia ran the booth. She smiled at customers. She sold dried rosemary and lavender balm and did not look at James more than the situation required. What James did, not knowing any of this, he helped an elderly woman carry her purchase back to her car, walking the full way across the festival grounds and returning without mentioning it. He answered a child's question about what lavender smelled like with a patience that was completely unperformed, crouching to her level, letting her smell his wrist where he'd brushed the bundles. He turned down a drink from a man at the next booth who was clearly looking for company in the afternoon, gently, without making the man feel refused. And when the booth beside theirs had a small structural issue, a canopy pole worked loose in the afternoon wind, he crossed over and held it steady while the owner found a fix, asking nothing and saying little. He was not doing any of this for her benefit. He did not know she was watching. She was watching. She watched him be exactly who he had always been with her, in a context where he had no reason to maintain an image for her. And something began to crack at the center of the thing she'd been building, the careful architecture of the suspicion she'd told herself was reasonable. Marcus came back to the booth as the afternoon wound down. He leaned close and said quietly, "I can't find a James Cooper in Memphis that matches him. But I found an Elijah Ross. And Nadia. That name has money behind it." She went very still. She said, "Thank you, Marcus." She did not look at James for the rest of the evening. She said nothing to him that night. Or the next day. She came to the farm the following Monday with tasks assigned and time organized in the particular way that meant she was putting distance between herself and something she hadn't decided how to handle yet. She was efficient and professional, and she called him James the way someone enunciates a name carefully when they are aware of exactly what they're saying. He noticed. He noticed the way careful people notice, without reaction, just a registering. He asked once, at the end of the first day, if everything was all right. She said, "Fine. Lot on my mind." He nodded. Went to his truck. Drove back to Mrs. Patton's garage room. The second day she gave him less to do and gave it from a distance. The third day she didn't come out of the house until afternoon. What she was doing in the house, trying to decide what she was angry about. She was not sure she had the right to be angry. He had lied about his name. But had he lied about anything that mattered? Had he told her something false and used it against her? Had he taken anything? She kept answering those questions with no, and then asking them again, because the feeling wouldn't resolve into anything she could name cleanly. She felt deceived. She felt foolish. She felt, and this was the one she kept turning away from, like she had let herself want something again and had been made to look like it. She pressed a hand flat on the kitchen table one afternoon and held it there. The lavender starters he'd repotted stood on the sill, thriving now. She looked at them for a long time. It was Rochelle who told her, because Rochelle had connections to Memphis through her brother-in-law and had heard the name Elijah Ross come up twice that week in contexts that sent her to a phone call. She came to the farm on a Wednesday afternoon unannounced, the way she always did, and she sat at Nadia's kitchen table and said, "His grandfather built Ross Agricultural Supply. They distribute to half the farms in Mississippi. His family runs the whole operation. He's been up there in Memphis this whole time being groomed for the business, and by all accounts he walked away from it about a month ago, just left, nobody knows exactly why." Nadia sat across from her. "He's been working my fields," she said. "Yes." "4-day wages." "Yes." She stood up. Walked to the window. The south beds were visible from here, the lavender starting to thicken along the rows, every plant he had touched. He knew this land, she said. More to herself than Rochelle. He knew what needed doing before I told him. He wasn't guessing. No, Rochelle said gently. He wasn't. She pressed her fingers against the window glass. The cold of it traveled up her hand into her wrist. He had not come here to deceive her. He had come here to be somewhere nobody knew his name, and she was the reason he'd stayed, and he'd been real with her every single day, with his hands and his patience and the coffee and the lavender pots. Every single day he had been exactly who he was. She had just been looking at the wrong thing to verify it. She pressed her hand to her sternum. Held it there. She drove to Mrs. Patton's that evening. He came down the stairs from the garage room and found her standing in the yard, and he read her face in that way he had, careful, non-assuming, and he leaned against the stair rail and waited. She said, "Your name is Elijah Ross." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes." "Why did you lie?" He was quiet for a beat. "I didn't lie about anything that mattered," he said. "I gave you a different name. I told you the truth about everything else. The work, the farming, what I know, who I am when I'm being it." "I don't know who you are when you're being it," she said. "I know who you are when you're working my fields with a name I didn't know was false." He stood up straight. "That's fair," he said. "I'm not done." She steadied herself. "I had Marcus look into you. At the festival. While you were at the booth." She watched his face. Something moved through it. Not anger. Something more like a long exhale of something he'd been holding. "I know," she said. "I know what that was. I know what I was doing. I did a version of that once before and told myself it was smart, and what it was fear." He looked at her steadily. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I'm not coming here to confront you. I'm coming here to apologize. For the distance this week. And to tell you that what Marcus found didn't change what I know about you." She paused. "What I know is those lavender pots and the gate hinge and the way you talked to that little girl at the festival and the fact that you spent your lunch fixing something that wasn't your job to fix and didn't say a word about it. That's what I know." He came down the last step. He stood close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw. "Being watched," he said quietly. "When you don't know you're being watched and then you find out, it has a cost. I know that." He looked down briefly. "I've been watched my whole life from the other direction. For what I have. I came here because I was tired of that. And I have to ask myself, honestly, whether I've just traded one version of being watched for another." "You might have," she said. "I won't pretend that's not true. What I can tell you is that what I saw was real, and that I'm standing here right now instead of being quiet and proud at my kitchen table, which is what the old version of me would have done." He was still for a moment. "I should have told you my name," he said. "That was wrong. Not because it changed anything, but because you deserve to know it." "Yes," she said. "Elijah," he said. Like he was giving it to her properly this time. "Nadia," she said, though he knew her name. It was an exchange. A starting over. Her father came up from Hattiesburg on a Sunday 2 weeks later. Frank Beaumont was 61, a retired high school principal, and a man who applied the same quiet rigor to the people in his daughter's life that he had applied for 30 years to the running of an institution. He shook Elijah's hand in the yard, looked him over without pretending he wasn't doing it, and said they should take a walk. Nadia watched from the porch without interfering. They walked the back of the property, along the creek where the wild rosemary grew. Frank was silent for a stretch. Then, "I know who your family is," he said. "Looked you up before I came." Elijah nodded. "Then you know my question." "You want to know why I'm here," Elijah said. "Working a farm under a false name. I want to know what you think you're doing with my daughter." Elijah considered this genuinely. "I came here to find out what I was without everything attached to my name. Whether that was wise, I'm still deciding. But what I know is that your daughter is the most clear-eyed, capable person I've been around in a long time. And what she built here, she built without anyone handing it to her. I respect that more than I can easily say." He paused. "I'm not here because Sycamore Hollow was convenient. I'm here because she is. And I understand that I've made it complicated, and I'm not asking you to overlook that." Frank walked for a moment. "She was hurt before," he said. Someone she trusted used her trust like a resource. I know, Elijah said. Are you that kind of man? Elijah looked at the water moving through the rosemary roots along the bank. I have more money than she knows. And I came here without disclosing my name. Those are the facts that should concern you. He looked at Frank directly. What I don't have is a record of using people. What I have is a habit of trying to be straightforward about what's real, and I failed that when I came here under a different name, and I've said so. He stopped walking. I can't prove what kind of man I am in a conversation. I understand that it's time that proves it. Frank looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then take your time, he said. And don't waste it. He walked back toward the house. At the porch, he looked at Nadia in a way that contained a full opinion without a single word. She received it. She nodded once. 3 weeks later, in the greenhouse on a Saturday morning with the early light coming through the plastic panels in long soft columns, Nadia told him about the test at the festival. The whole thing. What she'd asked Marcus to do, what she'd been looking for, what Marcus had come back and told her. Elijah was repotting seedlings. He did that sometimes on weekends still, just because the work was pleasant, and he set down the pot he was holding and looked at her. You were watching me at the booth, he said. Yes. To catch me in something. To catch you in something, she confirmed. He picked the pot back up. He looked at the seedling in it. And what did you catch? You helping Mrs. Ida to her car. You with that little girl and the lavender. She paused. You just being exactly yourself without knowing I was looking. He was quiet. You know what the test actually was, he said finally. Not what you thought it was. The real test. The thing that took something from you to do. He set the seedling down carefully in its new container. Coming here and telling me about it. That was the trust. Not the watching. The telling. She looked at him. In her hands, she'd been holding a bundle of dried rosemary. She'd picked it up without thinking when she came in. She'd been turning it in her fingers the whole time she talked, the familiar dusty scent rising from it. He reached over and took it from her hands gently. Set it on the shelf between them. We're even, he said. I hid my name. You tested without asking. Now we know each other. The greenhouse became their place in the weeks that followed. Not exclusively, and not sentimentally. Just naturally, the way places become yours when you've said something true in them. They worked in it on weekends, expanding the seedling operations, building 2 new raised beds along the south wall, installing a better drainage system that Elijah designed and Nadia improved twice before they agreed on it. The work was slow. Some days the soil was wrong and had to be amended before anything else could happen. Some days a tray of seedlings didn't take and had to be started again. Nadia had done this work for years and knew its patience requirements. What was new was doing it alongside someone who had the same patience and didn't need to explain that to her. There were good days. Days when everything worked and the light inside the greenhouse in late afternoon turned gold and something settled between them like a room settling on its foundation, not dramatic, just right. He learned the names of all her grandmother's original plants, the ones still growing in the original 1977 rows. He asked her to tell him their stories and she did, more than she'd told anyone in years, because he received them the way he received most things, quietly and completely, with room for her to keep going. She brought coffee. He fixed things that broke. She named the seedlings in the second row after characters in books she loved. He looked up the books. Spring became early summer. The dogwood at the greenhouse entrance put out its full bloom and then released it. Time passed in the only way that mattered, not fast, not slow, but forward. She set it in the greenhouse. A Thursday evening, both of them there later than planned because a problem with the irrigation coupling had kept them working past sunset. The lantern was on. The rosemary bundle was on the shelf between the seed trays, still there, dried now, small and settled. I love you, she said. She wasn't looking at him when she said it. She was coiling a section of hose. He stopped what he was doing. I know I'm difficult, she said. I know I take a long time to trust things and I test when I'm scared and I am still working on the testing. She set the hose down. But I love you. And I thought you should know. He came around the bench. He stood near her but not pressing. He looked at her with the same steady, uncomplicated attention he'd given her since the first morning. Nadia, he said. She looked up. I love you too, he said. No drama. No performance. Just the fact of it, the way he stated all true things simply, with nothing attached to require anything from her in return. Have for a while. She nodded slowly. He reached over and touched her face once, briefly, his thumb at her cheekbone. Then he picked up his section of work again. She picked up hers. The lantern held its light. Outside, the summer night settled over the farm like something patient finally allowed to rest. He proposed in the greenhouse, which was not where the story started but was, by then, where the realist version of their story lived. October. The seedling trays were in their fall configuration. The rosemary bundle was still on the shelf. She'd left it there through all the months, not consciously, just hadn't moved it. It had dried to a small silvery gray cluster that still held its scent if you pressed it. He'd gone back to Memphis in July. Not to stay. To have the conversation with his father, with the company, with the version of his life that had been waiting. He'd come back to Sycamore Hollow within the month, and Nadia had met him in the yard and he'd said, I'm not going to run the company. My cousin's taking the role. I'm going to start something here. He'd paused. If there's a here to start something in. She had looked at him for a long moment and then said, there is. In October he asked her in the greenhouse on a Tuesday evening when nothing significant was happening, because nothing significant needed to happen. He had the ring in his shirt pocket, not large, not ostentatious, a simple thing chosen with care, and she said yes before he'd quite finished asking, which made him laugh, which was a sound she decided she wanted to hear for the rest of her life. He picked up the dried rosemary bundle from the shelf after. Turned it in his fingers the way she'd been turning it the day she told him about the test. He held it out to her. My grandmother's farm, she said, taking it. Your farm, he said. She looked at the ring on her hand. She looked at the bundle in her palm. She looked at him. Your name is Elijah, she said. Yes, he said. I'm glad you stayed, she said. Yes, he said again. So am I. Here's what this story is really about. It's not about the money or the name or even the lie. It's about what we're actually looking for when we test people. What we're really asking is, are you going to use me? Are you who you say you are when nobody's watching? Are you safe? And those are not bad questions. Those are human questions. But there's a difference between protecting yourself and building a wall so high that nothing worth having can get over it. Elijah hid his name because he was tired of being known as a resource before he was known as a person. Nadia tested him because she'd confused caution with wisdom. They were both hiding, in their different ways, from the same thing, the risk of being known completely and chosen anyway. What changed everything wasn't the reveal. It was the telling. Her going to him and saying, I did this thing and here's why, and I'm not going to pretend it was fine. That's not weakness. That is the hardest and most necessary kind of courage. The rosemary bundle on the shelf. Still there. Through all of it. That's what trust looks like. Not a single grand moment. Just something small you don't move, because you're not done with it yet. 2 questions before you go, and I really want to hear your thoughts. First, do you think Elijah was wrong for hiding his real name, or was that actually something you understand? And second, at what point in the story did you think Nadia and Elijah were actually going to make it? Tell me in the comments, I promise I read them all. If this story moved you even a little, please like this video and share it with someone who's afraid to trust again. Subscribe if you haven't. We release a new story every week, and I promise they all hit differently. And next time a woman calls off her wedding at the altar, then meets the man she should have chosen 10 years earlier at the exact worst possible moment. Will it be too late? You do not want to miss it.